why don't we get started then? The regiment that I wrote my book, it's called Riders in the Storm, is the 5th Massachusetts Volunteer Cavalry. And they were sent to Washington the first week or so of May 1864. They assembled on 13 May and marched to Alexandria, where they embarked on the transport Webster. The regiment arrived off Fort Monroe, Virginia, at the mouth of the James River on 15 May and halted from orders. From Fort Monroe, the 5th Massachusetts was ordered to City Point to join the African American 3rd Division 18 Army Corps and arrived on 16 May. Brigadier General E.W. Hinks commanded the 3rd Division. Edward Winslow Hinks had been born and raised in Maine, but moved to Boston in 1849. He was a member of the Massachusetts legislature in 1855, where he made the acquaintance of Benjamin Butler. As Ezra Warner writes in Generals in Blue, probably at the instance of Benjamin F. Butler, under whom Hinks subsequently served, he was appointed a 2nd lieutenant in the regular army. At the same time, he was serving as lieutenant colonel and colonel of a 90-day regiment of Massachusetts militia. Hinks became colonel of the 19th Massachusetts Infantry in August 1861, one of the regiments that took part in the Union debacle at Ball's Bluff in October 1861. Colonel Hinks was wounded at Glendale during McClellan's Peninsular Campaign and badly wounded twice at Antietam. Promoted to Brigadier General in April 1863, General Hinks served on court-martial and recruiting duty while convalescing. His previous post, before taking charge of the 3rd Division 18 Army Corps, was command of the prisoner of war camp at Point Lookout, Maryland, where he served for 2 months. So, the discussion of the strategic goals of the Bermuda Hundred Campaign and what had been accomplished prior to the arrival of the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. In the Eastern Theater, Grant and the Army of the Potomac had to contend with Lee's well-led army of veterans. An attempted turning movement on the Confederate left from the Rapidan River to Lynchburg, Virginia, would have cut Lee's line of retreat to the west and south and possibly created a Vicksburg-style investiture of Richmond. But Grant and the Union Army would not have had a supply line, a very precarious situation, wrote Herman Hathaway and Archer Jones in How the North Won. Attacking from the west meant to gamble that the Army of the Potomac would be able to push back the Army of Northern Virginia into the Richmond defenses, thus breaking Lee's communications and reestablishing their own. The risk of leaving Washington, D.C. uncovered and being cut off without logistical support was too great. Neither Grant nor his predecessor, Meade, was willing to try this plan. Instead, Hathaway and Jones wrote, Grant had no course open but to turn Lee on the east, where Grant could base himself on the series of Virginia rivers. Just pushing Lee back was not enough, however, and Grant knew it. The Army of the Potomac, with superior numbers and excellent logistics, would be able to take the initiative, but there would be no surprise on the part of the Union. According to Archer Jones in Civil War Command and Strategy, the soldiers on both sides well understood that this stalemated war of high ratio of force to space, and they most diligently and adroitly practiced the ancient art of field fortifications. Grant was confident that his better equipped, better supplied, and numerically superior army would be able to push Lee back into the Richmond defenses. The question was, in sending Butler and the Army of the James up their namesake river, how long it would take for the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James to link up. Another question, unasked at the time, but that has dogged Grant's reputation ever since, was how high a cost in casualties was Grant willing to pay. Politically attuned, Grant also expected to capture Richmond. Grant knew that the public did not understand strategic turning movements or interior lines of communication. The dramatic defeat or destruction of an enemy army or the occupation of an important city were seen by all as clear-cut victories. to begin the strike at Richmond with an attack by waterborne troops. Grant turned to Ben Butler, who in the spring of 1864 commanded the Department of Virginia and North Carolina, based at Fort Monroe. Grant did not heed the words of Chief of Staff Halleck, who had the innate mistrust of the regular Army officer towards the political appointee. In April 1864, Halleck wrote to General Sherman that it seemed little better than murder to give important commands to such men as Banks, Butler, and McClernand. No general was more political than Ben Butler. Butler had been a prominent attorney and Democratic politician in Massachusetts before the war. He had gained a certain notoriety at the Democratic Party's convention in 1860, where he cast 57 consecutive ballots for Jefferson Davis as President of the United States. When the war came, he firmly supported the Union, however. Butler took advantage of his position as Brigadier General of Militia in Massachusetts' advanced state of preparation in 1861 to lead the Union regiments that seized Annapolis and Baltimore, Maryland. Credited with relieving Washington, Butler was commissioned a Major General of Volunteers by President Lincoln in May of 1861. While he commanded at Fort Monroe in 1861, forces under Butler were defeated at Big Bethel, Virginia, in an action more embarrassing than sanguinary. Northern troops making a night march fired into each other. The next day, on 10 June 1861, the main body of Union troops milled about as they waited for their officers to figure out what to do. The officers, Butler wrote, carefully disobeyed orders, which were to go right ahead with fixed bayonets and fire but one shot, and they did not even do that. Little more than a skirmish, Federal losses were 18 killed, 53 wounded, and 5 missing, while the Confederates under command of General John Bankhead Magruder lost 1 killed and 7 wounded. Big Bethel was mostly a publicity victory for the South, as trophies from the fight were displayed in Richmond shop windows. It will be recalled that it was Butler, while commanding at Fort Monroe, who coined the term and the legal interpretation, contraband of war, for escaped slaves who entered the Union lines. General Butler also commanded the successful amphibious assault at Hatteras Inlet in August of 1861. The following May, he served as overall commander of land forces in the expedition that captured New Orleans. Named military governor of the Crescent City, Butler's tenure was controversial, to say the least. Butler was given the nickname Beast Butler by Southerners and declared an outlaw by President Davis for, among other acts, hanging a man who had torn down the national flag, and his famous Women Order, General Order number 28, dated 15 May 1862. It is ordered that hereafter, when any female shall by word, gesture, or movement insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation. Butler was also accused of peculation. A libel that followed him for the rest of his life concerned the theft of silverware from the house where he made his headquarters. He was relieved of command in December 1862 by President Lincoln because of an altercation involving the foreign consuls in New Orleans. Ezra Warner, author of Generals in Blue, writes that he governed effectively and performed useful service is impossible to deny, but that he lined his own pockets and those of his family and friends seems equally evident. Butler was without a command until November 1863, when he returned to Fort Monroe as commander of the Department of Virginia and North Carolina. The department comprised a few square miles of tidewater shoreline and several thousand square miles of water, according to Richard West, who was one of Butler's biographers. The Yorktown Peninsula, the city of Norfolk, and federal outposts in North Carolina at New Bern, Little Washington, Plymouth, and Roanoke Island were included in Butler's command. General Grant met with General Butler at Fort Monroe on 1 April 1864. Grant put the gist of that meeting in a letter to Butler dated the next day. Butler was to concentrate 16,000 men from his own department, which would form one Army Corps, the 18th. Added to the 18th Army Corps would be 18,000 troops from the Department of the South. Major General Quincy Adams Gilmore would command the latter troops, designated the 10th Army Corps. Grant, at the end of his letter, reminded Butler of his objectives without denoting a specific timeline. When you are notified to move, take City Point with as much force as possible. Fortify, or rather entrench at once, and concentrate all your troops for the field there as rapidly as you can. From City Point, directions cannot be given at this time for your further movements. The fact that it has already been stated, that is, that Richmond is to be your objective point, and that there is to be cooperation between your force and the Army of the Potomac, must be your guide. This indicates the necessity of your holding close to the south bank of the James River as you advance. Then, should the enemy be forced into his entrenchments in Richmond, the Army of the Potomac will follow, and by means of transports, the two armies would become a unit. So that is the letter that Grant gave to General Butler. General Butler, in his version of the meeting with Grant, wrote that General Grant had told me in conversation if I could hold the Petersburg and Richmond Railroad cut for 10 days and secure our proposed base at Bermuda and City Point, that by that time he would join me there, or on the James about Richmond, having either whipped Lee's army or forced it into the entrenchments around Richmond when the combined armies of the Potomac and my command would invest Richmond, the Navy holding the James and approaches. So Butler's version differs than the meeting with Grant, what Grant wrote in his letter. Several factors would appear to be at odds in Butler's report of the conversation with Grant and the latter's written orders. Grant may have been confident of success against Lee, but did he explicitly predict that the Army of the Potomac would have driven Lee into the defenses of Richmond in 10 days' time? Also, did Grant mean for the Army of the James to seize and fortify Bermuda Hundred? Butler believed that he did, for on page 16 of his appendix in Butler's book, which is his Apologia, is the copy of a dispatch sent by General Grant on 16 April. It reads, all the forces that can be taken from the coast have been ordered to report to you at Fortress Monroe by the 18th instant of April, or soon thereafter as possible. What I ask is that with them and all you can concentrate from your own command, you seize upon City Point and act from there, looking upon Richmond as your objective point. So we can see City Point on the right-hand corner, and directly above that is the area known as Bermuda Hundred. So this became a source of controversy because Grant never mentions Bermuda Hundred. Keep what vessels you may be, so Grant continued, keep what vessels you may be necessary for your operations. No supplies are going to North Carolina, except as such may be necessary for the troops there. I presume the call for vessels is in consequence of the preparation ordered for supplying our armies after a new base is established. Butler footnoted that last sentence of Grant's by writing, i.e. at Bermuda Hundred, called City Point in General Grant's and General Halleck's dispatches. Now, presumably Generals Grant and Halleck, who could read a map as well as the next man, would have written Bermuda Hundred if that's what they had meant, rather than City Point. Another factor in Grant's orders was that he omitted any mention of attacking Petersburg. One of the experts on this is a historian named William Glenn Robertson, who believes that the chief flaw in the federal plan of operations was its fixation upon Richmond. Butler has been roundly condemned for not immediately taking Petersburg in May. This failure is magnified by the more than 9 months spent in the trenches around the cockade city. This is hindsight with a vengeance, however. No one could have anticipated at the siege, now more properly an investiture, of Petersburg in May of 1864, or April for that matter. As the Army of the James maneuvered, portions of the army were detached to garrison City Point, forts on the James River, and the Bermuda Hundred defenses. As Robertson notes, to garrison Petersburg against the Confederate brigades arriving by rail from the Carolinas would have required a major portion of Butler's remaining troops and precluded an advance in strength against Richmond, as Grant's plan specified. It's outside of the scope of the map, but Petersburg is on the left of this, and further another 10 or 12, maybe 20 miles or so north of that of Petersburg is the city of Richmond. So they're pretty close together, and they're both on the river. So later in Grant in his memoirs and Grant's aide Horace Porter in his military history asserted in what may have been hindsight after the campaign broke down that Butler was instructed verbally to seize Petersburg, but nowhere in his written instructions did Grant refer to the city as either a primary or a secondary goal. To reiterate then, these were the goals for the Army of the James. First, to seize and fortify a base as far up the James River as could be effected with naval collaboration. Second, to break the Confederate transportation network. Third, to distract and divert Confederate units that might otherwise reinforce the Army of Northern Virginia. And fourth and finally, to threaten or seize, if possible, the city of Richmond. All this was to be done, again, if possible, during the 10 days from 5 to 15 May. Since a campaign may fail in planning, execution, or both, let us examine briefly the high command of the Army of the James. It is indeed extraordinary that the left wing of Grant's strategic plan, the anvil to his hammer, would be entrusted to an Army commander totally without practical training and also completely without experience of moving troops around a battlefield. As Robertson notes in Backdoor to Richmond, which is kind of the definitive study of the Army of the James part of the campaign, William Glenn Robertson's book, Backdoor to Richmond, Butler's actual combat experience was nil, since he had never personally led a large column in field operations. Big Bethel had been a mere skirmish fought by subordinates. The action against the Hatteras forts had been primarily a naval show. And New Orleans had required a police commissioner more than a combat commander. But Grant was stuck with the Bay Stater for political reasons. Butler could not be relieved, and he insisted on taking active field command instead of remaining in Fort Monroe and playing an administrative role. Grant sought to leaven the untried Massachusetts general with two regular Army West Point graduates, William Farrar Smith and Quincy Adams Gilmore. Smith, to differentiate him from other Smiths, was known in the Army as Baldy Smith, he was a Grant protege. Graduated from the Military Academy in 1845, Smith earned distinction as an engineer officer before the Civil War. Returning to West Point to teach that science, a native Vermonter, he had become colonel of the 3rd Vermont Infantry in July of 1861. He had served on the staff of General Irvin McDowell at the First Battle of Bull Run and was promoted to Brigadier General of Volunteers on 13 August 1861. Later, Smith commanded a division of the 6th Army Corps on the peninsula and during the Maryland campaign. He then acceded to command of the 6th Army Corps prior to the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. After the Union debacle at Fredericksburg, Smith, whose promotion to Major General was before the U.S. Senate, co-signed with General William B. Franklin, the commander of the Left Grand Division of the Army of the Potomac, a letter to President Lincoln extremely critical of their commander, Ambrose E. Burnside. This act of disloyalty cost Smith both his corps command and his promotion, as the Senate failed to approve the recommendation that he be promoted to Major General. While serving as chief engineer of the Department of Cumberland with the rank of Brigadier General, the Vermonter was able to redeem himself during operations around Chattanooga, Tennessee. General Grant was favorably impressed with Smith for he promoted him to chief engineer of the military division of the Mississippi in October of 1863. Grant also sponsored Smith's promotion to Major General, writing the Secretary of War on 12 November 1863 to request that Smith be placed first on the list for promotion to the rank of Major General. Grant considered him possessed of one of the clearest military heads in the Army and is very practical and industrious. So when Grant moved east to take up command of the Army of the Potomac, he brought William Farrar Smith with him and put him in command of the 18th Army Corps under Butler. Smith was duly confirmed as a Major General on 9 March 1864 and took command of the 18th Army Corps, comprising troops of the Department of Virginia and North Carolina, some 16,000 men. Another 18,000 men making up the 10th Army Corps came up from South Carolina under the command of Major General Quincy Adams Gilmore. Gilmore was another West Pointer, the top-ranked student in the class of 1849. His class rank gave him a first assignment in the Corps of Engineers. Like Smith, Gilmore taught engineering at the military academy before the war. Unlike Smith, however, Gilmore had never been a line or a field officer. His promotions to Brigadier General 28 April 1862 and Major General 10 July 1863 came about as a result of successful engineering work, most notably his reduction of Fort Pulaski in Savannah Harbor and the capture of batteries Wagner and Gregg and the deployment of the 8-inch rifled cannon known as the Swamp Angel during federal operations to recapture Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. There were some flaws in the high command of the Army of the James. First of all, Gilmore had held departmental command in South Carolina. He was now in a subordinate position to an unskilled and inexperienced non-professional superior, Butler. Added to that, as Robertson notes, was the fact that except for some limited and catastrophic offensive operations in the Department of the South, Gilmore was as inexperienced as Butler in commanding large units in a campaign of maneuver. Furthermore, Smith had perhaps too much experience to be serving under Butler. Equal in position to Gilmore, Smith could only suggest possible courses to the 10th Army Corps commander. Moreover, Butler was too unsure of himself to make the two work together. Further complicating matters was the fact that Smith was opinionated and took orders poorly. Even Grant, who was his sponsor, wrote that Smith was likely to condemn whatever is not suggested by himself. Coupled with Smith's irascibility, his protege and devoted admirer, James Harrison Wilson, called him a consciously contentious man, was his slowness to act. Adam Bedeau, an officer on Grant's staff who wrote the 3-volume military history of Ulysses S. Grant, noted that Smith was over-anxious to prepare for every possible contingency. His skill was great, his judgment was cool, but his movements were somewhat too elaborate. In Butler's version of events, written in later life, he wrote that Smith had the one inevitable regular army failing: interminable reconnaissance, waiting and waiting, not going at a thing when he was told to, but looking all around to see if he could not do something else than what he had been ordered to do. It should be remembered before we're too quick to condemn the high command of the Army of the James that these men did not operate in a vacuum. There were division and brigade commanders, regimental officers, and enlisted men. All bore some responsibility for the success or failure of the campaign. Opposed to these men, of course, were over 20,000 Confederate troops with the skillful and experienced PGT Beauregard in command. Several aspects of the Army of the James made it unique among all Civil War armies. This army was the largest led by a political general, and the only one to have a political goal, the capture of Richmond, as its primary objective. Historian Edward Longacre, writing in Military Affairs magazine, considered the Army of the James the most highly politicized fighting force in American history. Part of that politicization was the politics of race. The Army of the James contained the highest number of African American troops in the Union Army, as much as 40% of its maximum strength of 40,000 officers and men, Longacre pointed out. At a time when it was official Washington policy not to pay African Americans the same as whites and not to commission them, and when other armies used them as fatigue details or wagon guards or garrison troops, and doubted the capacity of blacks as soldiers and even as human beings, Butler welcomed them to the Army of the James. The Army commander encouraged the enlistment of African Americans in cavalry and artillery units, willingly accepted black regiments in exchange for white ones, and provided housing, employment, and rations for the women, children, and elderly contrabands who came into his area of operations, many of whom were the dependents of troops enlisted in the Army of the James. So let's turn now to the events that occurred with the operations that the Army of the James undertook. First thing that the Army of the James did was they sailed up the James River and seized City Point, which they did on 5 May. This was done by General Hinks's 2nd Brigade of the 3rd Division. At the time, he was a brigade commander instead of a division commander. He later acceded to division command in the 18th Army Corps. So one of the aspects of this politicization, if you will, of the Army of the James was that Butler entrusted his African American troops with some of the most important jobs that they had. So he had cavalry following the naval vessels on the shore, African American cavalry, and the first troops ashore at City Point were black. So Thomas L. Livermore, a young officer on General Hinks's staff, left an account of the seizure of City Point on 5 May. The steamer with General Hinks and his staff came up with the naval vessels under Admiral Samuel Lee, which had halted at Harrison's Landing about 4 miles below City Point. According to Livermore, our signal officer communicated with one on Admiral Lee's ship and asked what the Navy proposed to do, and received for answer that the Admiral was about to go on board an ironclad and go up. Admiral Lee was apparently fearful of striking a floating mine called a torpedo in the Civil War. General Hinks, Livermore wrote, thought that this was rather contemptible in the Admiral and ordered the Army transport to go ahead. City Point at the time, in May of 1864, was used as a prisoner of war transfer station. There was a Confederate flag flying at City Point, and Captain Livermore was determined to seize it. Without waiting to look at surroundings much, I jumped ashore with an axe in hand with which to cut down the rebel flag, and in company with some of our headquarters orderlies and guards, I ran up the bluff. Livermore and his party had soon captured the flag and driven off a few Confederate soldiers who put up no resistance. Most of them were soon captured. And a rebel captain or lieutenant walked up to me at this juncture, Livermore continued, and with great asperity of manner said that this was a flag of truce station and demanded my name. I paid him the attention of seeing that he was taken prisoner, and that was all. So at the time, there was an exchange where Union troops would be exchanged for Confederate troops. And at the beginning of the Overland campaign, General Grant decided that this was no longer going to occur. So City Point, which later became the Nexus supply depot for the Army investing Petersburg, and then which led in turn to the attack on Richmond, and then to breaking the line around Richmond, which of course led to the winning of the war at Appomattox. At one point, there was a United States military railroad that ran all the way along south of the current. You see the railroad track that goes down to Petersburg. So the U.S. Army engineers built their own railway to service the trenches around Petersburg. It was an extraordinary operation. So the remainder on 5 May, the remainder of the Army of the James sailed up to Bermuda 100, a landing about a mile further up the James, north of the Appomattox River. The James River bends south of Richmond. In 1864, the river passed two strongly held and well-sized Confederate emplacements at Chaffin's Bluff on the north and Drury's Bluff on the south, about 4 miles from the Confederate capital. Meandering until it makes almost an oxbow at a place called Farrar's Island, the James makes two more abrupt bends before it widens and deepens and joins the Appomattox, and then flows to the sea. The area directly across from City Point, bounded by the James on the north and the Appomattox on the south, is Bermuda 100. 100 being the term for Virginia political subdivision of colonial times. Let's see. Somewhat smaller than a county. From Point of Rocks on the Appomattox, about 3 miles upriver from its mouth, to Farrar's Island on the James, was a distance a little over 3 miles. This western edge of Bermuda 100 formed the famous neck of the bottle. Livermore, certainly with benefit of hindsight, roundly condemns Butler's decision to disregard Grant's instructions and land troops at Bermuda 100, speculating that the Bay Stater chose Bermuda 100 because he supposed the approach to Petersburg from City Point would be strongly opposed. So instead of going south from City Point to Petersburg, he put himself north. Butler put the Army of the James primarily north of the city of the river in Bermuda 100. This was certainly not the case, as the seizure of City Point shows. At the time, City Point was basically undefended. The Captain Livermore rightly sketched out what the general might have done instead. Butler might have occupied high and easily defended ground at City Point for his base, might have had a railroad in running order between that point and Petersburg, might have from that point approached Petersburg on the arc of a circle only 9 miles long, and might have had as fair an opportunity to approach Richmond and destroy the railroad as he could have. In operating from Bermuda 100, he chose in Bermuda 100 low ground and a point at least 14 miles from Petersburg as the road runs, without railroad communication and separated from Petersburg by the Appomattox, which is not fordable, and Swift Creek, which proved a formidable obstacle to his advance. Swift Creek right there. Yeah, so this was basically an error in execution. After the fact, there's lots of finger pointing that went on, but basically between Generals William Farrar Smith, Baldy Smith, Gilmore, and Ben Butler in overall Army Corps command, there was really a very poor lack of communication. Unfortunately for Ben Butler and the Army of the James, history is not made up of might have beens. Butler's poor decision-making would mean hot work for the troops under his command, including the regiment I wrote about, the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. The amphibious operation had gone flawlessly, and Butler wanted to push on the night of 5 May and seize Drury's Bluff, about 14 miles away. Both Smith and Gilmore strongly objected to the idea. Since the Federal cavalry under Brigadier General Kautz had been sent south of Petersburg to break up the railroads into the city, the two corps commanders felt that without cavalry reconnaissance, with only a portion of the troops landed, and during full darkness, such a plan was too reckless. One of them, Butler wrote, intimated that he should feel it his duty to refuse it, even if it were ordered. So obviously, you've got a lot of after the fact sort of Monday morning quarterbacking. And Butler, who was a skilled attorney and sort of cross-examiner and a skilled politician, could be extremely acerbic when it came to these West Pointers. Basically, he wanted to get them to do what he wanted, and they'd say, okay, sure. And then they go off and come up with another plan. So from 6 to 9 May, the Army of the James was engaged in digging fortifications across the Bermuda Hundred Neck and operating against the Petersburg and Richmond Railroad and the turnpike that ran between the two cities. The Bermuda Hundred defenses were within 2 miles of the railroad. Brigadier General Charles A. Heckman's 1st Brigade of the 2nd Division, 18th Army Corps was set out on 6 May as a reconnaissance in force. Heckman was instructed to ascertain Confederate positions and numbers, but not to bring on a general engagement. Heckman's brigade consisted of 4 regiments, some 2,700 officers and men, and was accompanied by 2 guns, a section of Battery L, 4th United States Artillery. This force was met by around 600 South Carolinians, 3 companies of the 25th South Carolina and the entire 21st South Carolina under Colonel Robert Graham at Port Walthall Junction, where a railroad line branched off the Richmond and Petersburg Road to Port Walthall on the Appomattox above Point of Rocks. The South Carolinians took advantage of a sunken road and screening woods to mask their numbers, and volley fire turned back the advancing Union troops. Heckman troops outnumbered the enemy over 4 to 1, but the general chose neither to flank the Confederate force nor to break the railroad. The Confederates considered this a victory, for they had saved the railroad from a veteran Union brigade supported by artillery. Their accomplishment is all the more impressive given that half the Confederate force arrived by train from Petersburg as Heckman was forming his brigade into line of battle and preparing to advance. Baldy Smith suggested to Butler that a more concerted effort to cut the railroad and engage the enemy be made on 7 May. General Gillmore had been ordered to detach troops to support Heckman's probe on 6 May, but had refused, perhaps because some 10th Corps units were still disembarking at Bermuda Hundred, and some were still marching from the landing to the trenches. Gillmore, however, chose not to explain why he refused Butler's order. Instead, he wrote, "The project of striking the railroad tonight with a detachment from this command has been abandoned for what I deem good and sufficient reasons." In order to continue work on the unfinished trenches, Smith suggested that a brigade be detached from each of the white divisions of the 10th and 18th Army Corps, allowing 5 brigades for what Butler called a demonstration in my front to destroy the railroad as far as possible between Petersburg and Richmond. General Smith was placed in overall command of this detachment and tactical command under the direction of Brigadier General William T.H. Brooks, the commander of the 1st Division of the 18th Army Corps. Butler reported that Gillmore was still uncooperative. Although my order to Gillmore was explicit, yet he claimed that his troops, which I had ordered should report to General Smith, were still under his own command, and because of his unofficer-like interference, it became necessary that I should issue a general order placing General Smith in command of the detached forces of the 10th and the 18th Army Corps, which had been ordered to operate towards Petersburg and Richmond on the railroad. On only the 3rd day of the campaign, the Bay Stater became disgusted with Gillmore's poor leadership and lack of cooperation, and determined to fix the 10th Corps commander. Ever the politician, Butler chose political means to punish Gillmore. Finding it impossible to get on with Major General Gillmore's tardiness of movement, and knowing that he was before the Senate for confirmation to the grade which he filled, I wrote a note to the chairman of the Military Committee of the Senate, Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts, asking that he bring his name before the Senate at once and have it rejected by that body, giving my reasons for making this request. Brooks's 5 brigades, numbering some 8,000 men, made contact with the Confederates on the same field as the day before. This is on 7 May. Confederate troops had been rushed to the spot, however, and now 2 weak brigades, comprising some 2,600 men, defended Port Walthall Junction. Brooks maneuvered his troops poorly. Attacks were made piecemeal and were not pressed with vigor. Of 19 regiments in this force, only 6 came under fire. While true that it was brutally hot, Heckman's brigade lost nearly 100 men to sunstroke, and the terrain was difficult, tangled woods cut by ravines and creeks, The turnpike and the railroad should have given sufficient orientation to Brooks and his brigade commanders. The end of the day saw a federal withdrawal to the Bermuda Hundred defenses. Once again, a Confederate force outnumbered this time by more than 3-1 had beaten back the federal attackers. William Glenn Robertson, having sifted through the official records, sums up the results of the expedition. Total Union losses amounted to 24 killed, 268 wounded, and 53 missing. In exchange for this sacrifice, Brooks had been able to place upon the railroad only half a regiment. The results amounted to 100 feet of track ruined, one small trestle burned, and several telegraph lines broken. While Major Generals Butler, Gilmore, and Smith were apparently satisfied with the results of the Union demonstration on 7 May, since they allowed the entire Army of the James to remain quiescent on 8 May, the lesson of Port Walthall Junction, that the Confederates were able to quickly concentrate men by rail, appears to have been lost on the high command of the Army of the James. The lower ranks of the Army, however, were not so self-deluded. S. Millett Thompson, who was an officer of the 13th New Hampshire and the regiment's historian, referred to the Second Battle of Port Walthall Junction more pointedly. Possibly the nearest answer ever made to the question, how to fight without winning, how to advance without going ahead. Thompson reported another theoretical question that was soon going around the Army of the James. How long will it take to get to Richmond if you advance 2 miles every day and come back to your starting point every night? So part of the reason that Butler persisted in demonstration against the railroad and chose not to drive immediately upon Richmond was his lack of any encouraging news from General Grant. All Butler knew was that the Army of the Potomac was fighting heavily in the wilderness. Until he could coordinate his movements with Grant, he made no concerted advance on the Confederate capital. So this continued on basically until 16 May. There was another attempt on the 9th of May, and then on the 16th, I can tell you what. So what General Grant did was he ordered what Butler called kind of a smelling committee. He ordered an inspection by General Meigs and another general named Barnard, who were engineer officers, to go down to the Army of the James and figure out what was going on, what was keeping them from attacking and having success. So after the Battle of Drury's Bluff, which was 16 May, the Union Army retreated into the Bermuda Hundred defenses and built a trench basically across the neck of it. This became what was known as the so-called bottle. And Ben Butler became ever after known as Bottled Up Ben Butler. So what the Army of the Potomac did was they ended up building a pontoon bridge over the Appomattox River and then coming south and linking up with the Army of the James on 15 June. So 15 June, the Army of the James and the Army of the James actually attacked along the City Point and Jordan Plank Road, the line that goes diagonally from right to left to Petersburg. And they had success at that point because the Confederate troops in Petersburg were largely denuded because they had gone up to Lee's army. So that the entrenchments, the redans and the redoubts and the artillery entrenchments and trenches around the city of Petersburg had largely been denuded of troops. So 15 June, the Army of the James had one last opportunity to attack, and they were met by troops from the Second Army Corps and in the trenches of Petersburg around 9 o'clock at night. But they did not break into the defenses of Petersburg. They did not take the city, even though they had taken a line of trenches at that point. At that point, General Smith, who was in overall command of the offensive troops, he was in tactical command of the troops which attacked on June 15th, decided to halt his advance and wait for the other troops that were coming down from the north from the Army of the Potomac. And ever since then, it has been a marked controversy as to whether the Union Army could have taken the city of Petersburg at that point. I thank you for your attention.